That summer was just pretty incredible. The idea that a club like Middlesbrough could sign a player like Fabrizio Ravanelli was just unthinkable. He was such an iconic figure in the Serie A, like the white hair and the shirt over the head. Like people who grew up watching Gazzetta Italia and on Channel 4, I think he just, the idea that he was coming to England just seemed like such a big deal. But Ravanelli was a player coming at his absolute peak. For him to then go ahead and score a hat-trick on his debut, it was the most electrifying experience I've ever witnessed in a stadium.
Hello and welcome to When Football Began Again, the podcast that takes a nostalgic look at the Premier League era. Today's show is a deserted island matches special with Tom Flight, author of the fantastic book Yer Joking Aren't Ya, the story of Middlesbrough's 96-97 season. In my opinion, it is one of the most remarkable seasons in English football history. A 3-point deduction, 2 losing cup finals, and a return to the first division, despite a squad of some incredible talent assembled by former England captain Brian Robson. We break down that season chapter by chapter. Tom takes me through kind of what went wrong and the aftermath of that as well. And in between, he picks some of his favourite matches. We normally do that from any Premier League season. It is very specifically from 96-97 today. So following on from last week's episode, a 96-97 themed episode this week. All of that very shortly. Speaking of last week, thank you for the lovely feedback we received on that show. It's a cracking season and I'm really pleased so many of you enjoyed that episode. We did also run a 96-97 goal of the season poll and picked our best ever Premier League player from Burkina Faso on the show last week. Both of those have gone out to polls. I'll reveal the winners at the end of today's show. And on today's show, I also asked Tom who the greatest Premier League Brazilian forward/midfielder is. You can maybe take an educated guess given his leanings who his choice is, but we will put that out as a vote after this once you've heard what Tom thinks in this show. But let's get to it. I am fascinated by this Middlesbrough team. I really enjoyed Tom's book and I hope that comes across. We talk about it in quite a lot of depth, pick some cracking matches. He's got some great choices as well. Tom is based in the USA these days, so he doesn't get to the Riverside quite as often as he'd like, but he is a very, very passionate and knowledgeable Boro fan, as you will discover. So I hope you enjoy this Deserted Island Matches with Tom Flight. Enjoy. Joining me today to discuss his Deserted Island Matches, which for reasons that will become clear are all based around 1996-97, and to chat through some of the memorable moments from that Middlesbrough season that year as recounted in his book Yer Joking Aren't Ya, it's author and Middlesbrough fan Tom Flight. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
Great to have you on. Really looking forward to talking about 96-97. Before we go into that season, which was a memorable one for Middlesbrough to say the least, how long have you been a Boro fan and when was your first match?
I was born in Leeds. I don't tend to admit that to many people back home, but we moved when I was 2 up to the northeast, and I can just remember getting into football and then just people in the school just talking about Middlesbrough, and it was around about the time when Robson and Gibson kind of took over the club. So it was about 1994 when I fully was, a Boro fan, which was kind of the perfect time. And the first game I went to was that season. It was in October, and we beat Swindon 3-1. It was the last season at the old Ayresome Park Stadium. I would say since about 1994, I've been a Boro fan.
Yeah, an exciting time, of course. Lots going on around that time for Middlesbrough. And you mentioned in the introduction to your book that the whole premise for the book came about from a rejected article. Your wife suggested you send it to publishers, and here you are now with a book deal. How did all that come about?
So there was a magazine that was I was kind of pitching a few ideas to, and I ended up just writing an article about the 96-97 season just because I thought it was a great story. And I'd always been talking to my wife about how I wanted to write a book, and I was kind of always looking for what the topic would be. And I remember it didn't get picked up by the magazine, but she read the article and she was kind of like, well, this is a story here that you could write a book about. And she kind of convinced me to do something about it. So I sent off a pitch to Pitch Publishing. I'm not, fully expecting to get another rejection, but they came back and said they were interested. So it was just kind of one of those things.
Amazing inspiration for any budding authors out there then. So let's go back to the beginning of Boro's brave new era. Former England captain Brian Robson becomes Middlesbrough player manager at the end of the 93-94 season. He reportedly didn't want the role until chairman Steve Gibson invited him out for dinner. What happened that changed his mind?
I think basically just meeting Steve Gibson and being just kind of swept away with his optimism and his vision, and probably got an idea of his bank account and realized that this could be something pretty special. I think Robson kind of in his autobiography, he kind of acknowledged that he grew up a Newcastle fan. He grew up in Chester Street, and I think he always thought of Middlesbrough as being not a particularly glamorous team from like a lower division. So I think when the call came, I don't think he was really taking it that seriously. But when he met with Steve Gibson, I think he just found his visions are so infectious, and they did the deal.
By the beginning of 96-97, Middlesbrough are in the Premier League. They're established. They've added Ravanelli and Emerson to a squad that already includes Barmby and Janino. It's the White Feather who begins to repay his £7 million transfer fee on opening day against Liverpool. And I believe that brings us nicely to the first match you take to your deserted island, which is a Premier League game involving Middlesbrough. So tell us more about that match.
Yeah, so this game was just, that summer was just pretty incredible in terms of like the optimism and just like the general vibe around the town. The idea that a club like Middlesbrough could sign a player like Fabrizio Ravanelli was just unthinkable. His last game for Juventus was in the Champions League final in '96, and he scored the goal. And that was the last time that Juventus won the Champions League. And he was just such a, to me, he just seems like he was just made for that Serie A. Like, he was such an iconic figure for the Serie A, like the white hair and the shirt over the head. Like people who grew up watching Gazzetta Italia and on Channel 4, I think he just, the idea that he was coming to England just seemed like such a big deal. And he was coming at his peak as well. I think like when you look at a lot of the players that are coming over from Europe during that time, there were a lot of players that were kind of coming at the tail end, and a few people like Cantona and Bergkamp, they'd almost been rejected a little bit, so they were coming to kind of like revitalize their career. But Ravanelli was a player coming at his absolute peak to a team like Middlesbrough. For him to then go ahead and score a hat trick on his debut was just, it was the most electrifying experience I've ever witnessed in a stadium. I mean, there was so much optimism, and like I just remember it being a scorching day, and I can remember it as being absolute hysteria going on in that stadium. Obviously, the game, when you look back, it does reveal a lot of the issues that the team had. I mean, we defended awfully. Every ball that got put in the box ended up being a goal for Liverpool, pretty much. So there were warning signs that were there pretty early on about the type of season we were going to have. But at that particular moment, it was just it was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I really remember that game clearly on Match of the Day, and it kind of being the lead match, opening game of the season, glorious sunshine, and as you say, this incredible new player for the Premier League. And yeah, with the greatest respect to Middlesbrough, he was coming into a side where the ambitions hadn't yet been realised, but what ambitions they were showing with that transfer window. There
was something about Ravanelli, like he developed kind of like a love-hate relationship with the crowd, and I think that the love part was formed like straight away. I think he only scored 2 goals away from home in the league. He scored 16 goals. 14 of them were at the Riverside. I mean, he scored a bunch of goals in the Cup. A lot of those were away from home, but they were like in Cup games, like semi-finals. So I feel like he almost fed off the crowd in a way. I think he was one of those players. When we were going and playing at Bedell or Upton Park, like he could just kind of like lose interest, or he'd get frustrated. But I feel like he was one of those players that really fed off the energy of the crowd, and like you could just see it from that game. Like that's what was happening. I mean, he was just like it was just like a rapturous almost.
Sketching over a wonderful rumour in the book that Robbie Mustoe was a founding member of Radiohead. I mean, I feel like that's a podcast entirely in itself. The early games of the season are encouraging. 18 goals in Middlesbrough's first 4 games at the Riverside. Ravanelli does score 10 of them, as you say. He was prolific at home. There's a 7-0 win against Hereford in the League Cup in there as well. I mean, is this before the days when squad rotation was a thing? Was it a surprise to see a Premier League side like Middlesbrough putting out a full-strength team against Division 3 opponents like Hereford?
I think that it was sort of the start of that, maybe, when people were starting to rest teams. I do know that there was talk at the start of the season. Like I can remember in the program for that Liverpool game, there's interviews with Robson, and they're talking about how they want to win a trophy, and how, like, because Middlesbrough had never won a trophy in their history at that point. and it's invested all this money, and there was this real sense that we wanted to go on a cup run, we wanted to try and win some silverware finally, and I mean this is what it was all about. So I think the club were just taking the cup games really seriously. With regards to that Hereford game, I mean maybe because it was early in the season and it was still a case of trying to get some match fitness or get the players to kind of chime together. And so maybe that's why Juninho and Emerson and Ravanelli all played in those early games. I know in the second leg about Hereford, it was pretty much the reserve team that came out. So there was a little bit of resting. I can remember the day after that Hereford game, everyone talking about it at school. Like it was a pretty big deal.
Winning 7-0 is always a treat, whoever it's against, isn't it? Middlesbrough do hit a poor run of form in the run-up to Christmas. They dropped from 4th to 16th as a result. The League Cup continues to provide a great distraction, though, demolishing Huddersfield, taking Newcastle's scalp at the Riverside as well. Ravanelli scored in both those games, despite the goals in the league beginning to dry up a little. Two factors in the drop down the table are the injury to Nigel Pearson, which keeps him out for 4 months, and the slightly shorter-term absence of Emerson, who's become a vital cog in the team. What happens with Emerson?
I mean, nobody really knows. I mean, it's kind of like it remains a mystery to this day. But basically, he disappeared, and I think they talk about his wife basically hating Middlesbrough. I think the quote is she called it a strange and terrible place. And so they kind of fled to Rio. I remember I spoke to Craig Hignett for the book, and he seemed to be under the impression that he went off to the Rio Carnival to kind of have a little party, but I don't think that's right, because I think the Rio Carnival is at the beginning of the year. But yeah, I think basically Emerson just massively regretted moving to Middlesbrough, and the form had turned, and there was obviously just bad vibes in the dressing room. He played at Porto for the last 3 years. He was the Portuguese Player of the Year, and he had played under Bobby Robson, and Bobby Robson apparently absolutely loved him. And then Emerson moved pretty early in the summer of '96 because Porto's finances were in a mess. So they got him out pretty quickly. He signed in May, and then Bobby Robson got the Barcelona job, I think in July. I think if Bobby Robson had known he was going to Barcelona, I think he would have made sure he took Emerson with him. Mm-hmm. And I think Barcelona they had Emerson's ear, and they were trying to sign him during that period. So I think Emerson was also distracted by that. I think it wasn't particularly a secret that Bobby Robson was trying to sign Emerson at this time as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a mixture of things as well. And I think also the culture of the club, they wanted to make these new stars happy, but they almost kind of let them do what they want. And I think that when Emerson just disappeared, I think the club were a little bit stuck about how to deal with it, really.
Yeah. A strange and terrible place is quite poetic in itself, isn't it? Yeah. And the second game to pick for your deserted island is a Middlesbrough game that's not in the Premier League, so a cup game from this season. Obviously, there's quite a few to choose from. What have you gone for?
I went for basically the best game, which I think is the semi-final against Chesterfield, where we drew 3-3. I was lucky enough to go to that game. It was at Old Trafford. And like I say, Middlesbrough had never been to a cup final in their history, like a major cup final. So to go to 2 in one season was a huge deal. We'd already been to the League Cup final. That was also one of the best kind of moment. Probably the best moment I've ever witnessed was when we scored in extra time to go 1-0 up at Wembley. Those 20 minutes when it felt like we were about to win a trophy was like probably the highlight of like my time as a Boro fan. And it just seemed like with the relegation battle we were facing and all the issues off the pitch, it just seemed like the cup games were like a release from all the drama and all the depressing factors about the club. We always just seemed to turn up for these great cup games. And this Chesterfield game, I don't know, it was one of those ones where it kind of felt like we kind of we kind of expected there would be a walkover, and then we went down to 10 men in the first half. It was a cagey kind of first half, but then after the halftime break, Chesterfield just came out, and the whole game was just off the rails. I mean, there's a period of that game where it is literally end to end for about 15 minutes, and there's every single time the ball goes at some event, Chesterfield had a goal which was disallowed. They went 2-0 up. There was penalties go flying either way, and it was one of the in terms of pure drama, it was probably unmatched in games that I've witnessed. So we went 2-0 down. Ravanelli got a goal back, and then Juninho got brought down. We got a penalty, which Craig Hignett scored, and then it went to extra time. And then when Festa got hold of the ball in the box, smashed it into the crowd, Old Trafford was just like absolutely erupted, and that was amazing. But then Chesterfield scored in the last minute to make it 3-3. I feel like the game almost kind of encapsulated the season into one game. There was just so many ups and downs. We were on the brink of an FA Cup final. It felt like all the hope and promise of the season was there. But then, of course, we all got brought back down when they scored at the last minute. So it was a pretty incredible game.
Middlesbrough made pretty light work of the replay to put their place in that FA Cup final. But as I mentioned on a previous podcast, I mean, I remember this game particularly well because I'm from Chesterfield, and those players kind of lived forever here and are still kind of legends. And of course, Sean Dyche, you know, famously kind of a lower league player, albeit a very good one at the time, and now a really successful managerial career. But he blasted that penalty down, and of course, I would say, on the goal that kind of never was, I think that would have made it 3-1. David Ellery, I don't think will ever be welcome in Chesterfield off the back of that.
I mean, it is true. I mean, if you look at the replay though, it looks like Ellery had already called the whistle before he took the shot. So I don't know if he was calling an offside or what. It's really in the book I mentioned that no one really knows what happened on that goal. But I mean, it probably should have been a goal for Chesterfield.
Yeah. It's an incredible game, incredible sort of semi-final. So going back to the book chronologically, a growing injury crisis arrives in the week before Christmas, along with a virus that strikes down half the squad. The club call the Premier League to request a postponement. Confusion reigns, but perhaps most crucially, nobody calls Blackburn manager Tony Parks to notify him of the request. He later likens Boro's approach to that of a Sunday League team. It's going to be a very costly breakdown in communication, isn't it? What happens?
Yeah, so we hadn't won in the league for about 3 months. Like I said, we kept winning in the cup, but the league form was just dreadful. We just got beaten 5-1 by Liverpool at Anfield, and we were absolutely demolished. It could have been about 15-1. And then, this virus went through the club. I don't think there's a dispute that we had a severe injury crisis as it was, but then this virus really was taking us out. And basically, I think it just kind of shows in that naivety of the club that they felt that they could call the game off. They called the Premier League to check what the rules were. And I think it's one of those cases where Robson and the chief executive, who's a guy called Keith Lamb, I think they were kind of desperate to call the game off, and they were kind of hearing what they wanted to hear from the league. Basically, the rule was if you have 11 players that are fit, then you have to play the game. And the club did have 11 players, but that wasn't really communicated on that phone call. I don't know if there's a rule book they should have been looking at or what. I don't really know what happened, but basically the league said that if you have just cause to call off the game, then you can do that. So Brian Robson and Keith Lamb set up a press conference and said that they were forfeiting the game. Like I said, they didn't call Blackburn manager Tony Parks, and he was pretty irate about that. As the investigation by the league was done, by the rules, they could have in theory fielded 11 players, even if they would pulled a bunch of youth players from the team. They decided to deduct 3 points, and I think there is a little bit of bitterness because the club did inform the league before they did it, and they did get advice. And I think that there's just a little bit like the league didn't take any responsibility for that. They just came down hard on the club. And as a Boro fan, I think it kind of feels like it's one of those things where if it had been a bigger club, like if a United or a Liverpool had done that, then it might not have been so harsh. But it always feels like the league doesn't mind coming down hard on lower clubs because they like to set an example. I think that's basically what happened. So later in January, towards the end of January, the league came out that they were officially deducting 3 points from our points total, and we ended up being relegated by 2 points. So it did end up making a pretty big difference.
Boro go into Christmas in the bottom three, with the looming threat of those sanctions from the league hanging over them at that time. The returns of Emerson and Juninho do bring much needed festive cheer and 3 points on Boxing Day against Everton. But that 3 point deduction is confirmed in mid-January, and they go bottom of the table as a result. Chairman Steve Gibson fumes at the injustice, but calls on the squad to get them out of trouble, starting at Sheffield Wednesday, where new recruits Vladimir Kinder and Gianluca Festa are added to the squad, with the latter making an immediate impact in a 4-2 home win. So despite the deduction and the poor start, it's fair to say everyone at Boro still is fully expecting them to have the quality to get out of trouble. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think throughout the season, I think there's always a sense that like people couldn't quite understand why we were playing so badly, and we clearly had the quality there. We showed earlier in the season that we beat West Ham 4-1. We beat Coventry 4-0. I mean, these were teams that we're in our battle with. We'd already kind of like dispatched them. in a weird way, and it never really felt like we were in a relegation battle with other teams. It felt like we were almost in a battle with ourselves, like particularly with that points deduction. Like I don't really remember looking closely at clubs around us until the very end, of course. But it always felt like we were going to get out of this. Like surely we'd kind of work things out. So I think that was kind of like the sense, because we were doing so well in the cups. That was showing our, like we had some great performances in the cup. We beat Newcastle, who we beat Liverpool in the cup. So I think that's basically where everyone was at. But the injuries kept happening, and we just couldn't quite do it.
The third game to take to your deserted island, and this is going to be a rare step away from Middlesbrough during this show. It is a Premier League game from 96-97, not involving Middlesbrough. Which game would you go for?
Yeah, so I had a little bit of trouble really picking a game for this, because I think maybe like a lot of Boro fans this season, because we had the 2 cup runs and the relegation battle for a long period, it felt like every game was so important. I feel like I wasn't as invested in the rest of the league as I normally am. Like I was looking at some of the games, like there are a lot of classic games this season, like the Newcastle beating United 5-0 and the Liverpool, the second 4-3 game, that United Southampton game where Southampton won 6-3. I just don't really recall them as well as I normally would, I feel like, because I was so invested in what was going on at the club. So I went for a game which is etched in my memory for some reason, and it's the North London derby where Arsenal beat Tottenham 3-1. I always had a soft spot for Arsenal during this period, and mainly because of Ian Wright. Like I loved Ian Wright, and I think his season here is kind of underlooked in a way. Like I think people forget how good he was this season. And I think people, when they talk about Arsene Wenger, because this was Arsene Wenger's first season, you think about Henry and Anelka, but I think people forget how well Ian Wright played under Wenger. I think he scored 23 goals. I think he scored in 17 of the 19 teams, which I think is still a Premier League record. Or I think maybe Van Persie equaled it. So I love this particular Arsenal team, because Paul Merson was playing for them, and he signed for Middlesbrough the next season, so I loved him. So and then the 2 goals towards the end. So it was 1-1. It was like a night game in the rain in Highbury, which always looks great. And it was a close game at 1-1. And then there was 2 goals at the end, which I've always been etched in my memory. There was Tony Adams got the second goal, where he's running up the pitch. It's 1-1. It's in the 89th minute or whatever. And you look at Tony Adams just storming up the pitch. He's like, what is he doing? And Bergkamp flicks the ball to him, and he just rifles it into the top corner. I also love Dennis Bergkamp during this period as well. And for me, this was the first, Dennis Bergkamp scored those goals, which only he could score. I feel like this was the first one of those goals, which I really remember, where Ian Wright loses a defender, crosses it in, and then Bergkamp has that first touch where he clips it past the defender, then curls it into the corner. But those 2 goals, I really loved. And with Ian Wright as well being involved, that's why I picked this game.
I know exactly what you mean about the Bergkamp goals, because obviously there was the one against Argentina that would follow, and the ones at Filbert Street, I think, as well, was incredible. It's interesting what you say about Ian Wright, though, because obviously Ian Wright was in a period where England's striking talent and the Premier League striking talent was off the scale. He probably didn't play as often for England as he might have done had he come a little bit earlier or a little bit later, perhaps. But I mean, he really was one of those players that he was that transition. Him, the Arsenal back four, Seaman. Arsene Wenger took the core of that side and then just built around it, didn't he, and created that fantastic team. Yeah.
And I think there's kind of like there's a little bit of a paradox between what Arsenal were doing here and what Middlesbrough were doing. I think Arsene Wenger came in and he completely changed the culture of that club, and he was bringing in these top players, and obviously that's a well-known story. But I feel like what Robson and Gibson were doing is they were bringing in all these world-class players, but they were still running the club like a 80s British club in terms of the culture. And I think that's something which Ravanelli really struggled with. My opinion of Ravanelli at the time was that I was kind of like frustrated with him, and I thought when he was kind of slagging off the club to the press and all that. But when I actually look at what he went through at Juventus compared to his experience at Middlesbrough, I think it's pretty. You can sympathise with him a little bit. I mean, you can question the way he acted, but I think there's just an interesting kind of correlation between what Arsenal were doing and what Middlesbrough were doing, and why one team succeeded and one team failed pretty miserably.
An interesting transitional period for the game, especially when Wenger comes in.
Yeah.
So, coming back to Middlesbrough, by the beginning of February, Middlesbrough are being cut further adrift from the safety line. Even if a pending appeal against 3-point deductions to be successful, they'd actually now still find themselves in the bottom three. Once again, the cup competitions offer a welcome distraction, though, with a two-legged League Cup semi-final against First Division side Stockport County for a shot at Wembley. Now, you mentioned in the book it's the biggest game in Stockport's history. How important was it to you as a Boro fan, and what did winning and getting through to Wembley mean to the fans?
I mean, it was huge because it felt like a real chance to get to Wembley for a final, and it felt like, playing a second division team, like this was a real opportunity. The club had been to the League Cup semi-final before. I know in 1992 they did, so it was a big deal, and it was during that period where the club were just about starting to get their act together. So this game, I think I'm right that this was the first game where Mark Schwarzer and Fester and Pearson played together, and when the three of them were in the defence, so we were a totally different team. So we won 2-0 in the second leg. It was on an absolute mud-soaked, awful pitch, perfect conditions for Stockport, and they gave it a real good go. It was Dave Jones was their manager, so they were doing pretty good. We had a few decent players there. I think they did get promoted that season as well. So they were a team full of confidence, and we managed to get 2 scrappy goals. The second leg was a pretty cagey affair. Stockport got an early goal, and then we kind of just hung on for the rest of the game. In terms of what that meant to the club, that was huge. I mean, there was a real great atmosphere in that second leg. I think Stockport, they went down 10 men towards the end of the game, so you could see that they kind of ran out of steam. So the atmosphere of the last 10 minutes, as we knew we were kind of on the way to Wembley, was pretty amazing.
I seem to remember that being live on ITV. I think that was when the League Cup semis were still two-legged affairs on terrestrial TV, and huge game and an impressive Stockport team. But Middlesbrough go through. The fourth match to now choose is a European night you'd relive again and again, specifically again from 96-97. It's quite a themed deserted island matches for you. Which game would you go for?
Yeah, just as a caveat, if I was on an island, I probably wouldn't rewatch this game very much because I don't particularly care for the teams involved. But I chose this. It was between this and there's 2 games which I thought of. One was the United against Porto when they won 4-0. I feel like that was the first real big European night for Manchester United. That seemed to be the night where they kind of arrived on the European stage. But I didn't pick that one because I couldn't really remember it. I'm not even sure if I watched it live. But this game, I can remember I did watch it. And it's when Newcastle beat Ferencváros 4-0 at St James Park. When you talk about that Newcastle side, the entertainers and all that, I know that they beat Manchester United 5-0, which is kind of like the peak of that team. But for me, this is when I think about that team and what they were capable of, this is a game I kind of think of because I just remember they absolutely battered them that night. In the first half, they hit the bar. Beardsley missed the penalty. They had so many chances. Their keeper was having one of the most unbelievable games ever. It was one of those games where it literally could have been 10-12-0. They did get a goal before half time, and then they just kind of unleashed in the second half. I remember Asprilla was playing. I don't think Shearer was playing in this game, but it was a big night for Asprilla. I think he always seemed to turn up for big nights for Newcastle. And then Ginola scored that incredible goal where he dinks it over the defender's head on the edge of the box and kills it into the top corner. I think I was looking at a YouTube video where it was kind of listing all the goals for Ginola scored. I think that was his last goal for Newcastle. I feel like you always forget they only played for 2 seasons and didn't actually score that many. When I pick up a European game, I pick this one just because it kind of sums up that entertainers game for me personally.
So heading into March, Middlesbrough have won just 1 Premier League game since Boxing Day. The appeal hearing is still a few weeks away, and they suddenly find a new gear, beating Derby 6-1, Leicester 3-1, Blackburn 2-1 and Chelsea 1-0. They climb out the bottom 3 as a result, reach a League Cup final and draw lower league opposition once again in Chesterfield in the FA Cup semi-finals. A reversal of the points deduction would cap off a near-perfect month and leave them in 14th place. Instead, the FA uphold their decision, infamously calling it right and fair. Robson and Janino win manager and player of the month respectively. I mean, even by this season's standards, that's one hell of a month in terms of those peaks and troughs, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a pretty incredible month. It started with that 6-1 game against Derby because I can remember kind of going to the stadium that evening, and there was a sense around the stadium like we kind of hadn't last couple of months, the form hadn't really gone that well. We had that win at Boxing Day, and then we couldn't really get going again. And it did feel like if we lost this game, then maybe that was it. But we came out and absolutely battered them, won 6-1, scored 5 goals in the second half. And this is also one of the games where Schwarzer, Pearson, and Fester were playing together at the back. And it felt like that defense kind of like unleashed the rest of the attack again. Like we kind of like had that kind of solid base at the back. So we were a completely new team. And then we went on that run, and the main reason is just Juninho. Like his form just went to a whole other level that month. He just had some of the best games I've ever seen, like against Chelsea and against Blackburn particularly. I remember Leicester game, which I didn't see that game, but everyone talks about that being the game where he absolutely tore Leicester City apart. We were 3-0 up by half time. And that's when Martin O'Neill made the decision to man-mark him in the League Cup final, because he was like, if we stop Juninho, we basically stop Boro. And that's basically what happened. So people always say that if we hadn't played that game, we might have won against Leicester, because that was the game where Martin O'Neill knew what he had to do to win.
The fifth and final match for Deserted Island. It's an international match from 96-97. Obviously, it's not a tournament season either, or maybe it is. Which game would you go for?
Yeah, so I was thinking of picking a U96 because that was the summer before, and U96, like, absolutely have so many memories of that. But I think because Venables left and Glenn Hoddle was the England manager, I kind of felt like this season is more associated with the Glenn Hoddle era. So that's why I went with the 2-0 win against Italy at the Le Tournoi that summer. I just have a lot of good memories about that kind of period. It did feel like after that tournament, we beat Italy, we beat France, and we won that tournament. It felt like England were back to being one of the best teams in the world again. And I just have a lot of fondness for that whole group of players. And in this game in particular, like Ian Wright obviously scored. And I think it shows that, you're talking about all the strikers that England had at their disposal at that point. I know that Shearer and Sheringham were kind of they had cemented the front two. I do think if this had been a tournament year, I think Ian Wright would have played a part, and his whole legacy at England would be a lot different. Also, for this game, I just think about that pass from Paul Scholes from the edge of the box where he just chips it over like a golf chip, and it just dips up perfectly for Ian Wright. It's one of the most incredible assists I've ever seen. But yeah, that's why I picked this game.
And yeah. I reckon most people listening to a show like this probably know all about Le Tournoi already. But I mean, How might you summarise for anyone who's wondering what on earth it was, and maybe they were too young to remember it? What was Le Tournoi?
It's kind of like it was like a warm-up tournament for the World Cup, right? So it was a chance for the top teams to kind of play each other and make the UEFA make some money.
Yeah, pretty much. I think they were just trying out France, weren't they? And of course, Le Tournoi is where Roberto Carlos scored that famous free kick that he spent the rest of his career trying to recreate at every opportunity. The League Cup final follows in April with Juninho stifled, as you've mentioned. Ravanelli scores the opening goal of the game in extra time, but a late Emil Heskey equaliser takes the game to a replay in the days when that was still a thing. Boro will lose after extra time in that replay. Sandwiched in between those games is the FA Cup semi-final against Chesterfield that we've mentioned at Old Trafford, widely considered to be one of the greatest games at that stage in the competition's history. More extra time and another replay, though. Where do you stand on that run of fixtures, ultimately costing Middlesbrough their place in the Premier League just out of sheer fatigue from the number of games and the extra time?
I think it absolutely played a huge part, because it wasn't just that we were playing all these games, is that they were all going to extra time and we were having all these replays. So we had a replay of the League Cup final. Both of those games went to extra time. We had the replay in the semi-final, obviously. In terms of fatigue, I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we were playing 2 games a week for what seemed like months at that point. And it's not just the games themselves, it's how much the games meant as well. So I think the players were kind of emotionally exhausted as well. I think if you watch the final game of the season when we were against Leeds, I think you kind of see that the players are just, physically spent, but also just like they just got literally nothing to give, like from an emotional point of view. That vibe was in the FA Cup final as well. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that the 2 cup runs cost us probably more than anything, even more than the 3 points really. And we had a injury crisis all the way through that season. It didn't stop. I mean, we signed Mark Schwarzer, and he played 5 games, and then he broke his leg, and then he was out. So we had to bring in Ben Roberts, who was like the third choice 21-year-old. He was playing in suddenly League Cup finals and FA Cup semi-finals. He'd been on loan at Bradford in the second division earlier that season. There's no doubt that was a huge factor.
Coming back to your deserted island, which current or former Premier League player would you choose to rescue you? Now, quick caveat on the rules here. Firstly, we are asking you to pick a player who played in 96-97, and there is a caveat that if the rescue mission fails, you will have to see out your days on the island with this player. Who have you gone for?
Yeah, so I'm definitely taking a risk because my first choice would probably be Emerson, because I think that if we did get stuck, I think we'd have a good time. And he was, I'll probably find him on the island anyway. He was just a mysterious guy. But yeah, with that caveat, I would not want to be stuck on an island with Gianluca Festa. I think he would be a pretty intense guy to be around. But I also think that he'd have the best chance of getting me out. Right. I've chosen him with a risk because I think he was such a passionate and he was a pretty crazy guy. I feel like he's got it in him to carry out a rescue mission. But like I say, I'm taking a risk because I don't think I want to be stuck on an island with him.
He was quite a cult figure, wasn't he, Festa at Middlesbrough?
Yeah. People loved him, and I think he didn't have that kind of like a lot of the Italian players. They had the skill and the finesse and all that. And I think he was a very kind of like cultured defender, but he had like this unbelievable passion, which I think English football fans just love to see. Like he was one of those guys who were kind of like, it felt like he'd laid down his life for the club sort of thing. Like, so he was definitely a cult figure. He came in, scored in his debut, and yeah, he's definitely a player that people think of very fondly back in Middlesbrough.
So after the disappointment of relegation, there's a shot at redemption with an FA Cup final against Chelsea. A brawl in the build-up and a Roberto Di Matteo thunderbolt inside the opening minute later, and it rounds off a season that is so near and yet so far. What are your memories of that FA Cup final day after relegation's now been confirmed, and that return to Wembley and the chance of lifting a trophy?
I can remember there being a very kind of different vibe to the Coca-Cola Cup final. I remember walking down Wembley Way and on that day of the League Cup final just being like such a great event. There was definitely a different vibe going on. I think there were a lot of fans that were just, like I say, they were just kind of like emotionally exhausted from the season. It felt like we didn't I don't feel like anyone really gave us a chance because we had all these injuries. We knew Ravanelli was injured, but he started the game, but he went off after 26 minutes. I think there wasn't a lot of optimism going into it. So it's the only time I've been to an FA Cup final. I don't really expect to ever go back to see Middlesbrough in one again. So in some ways, I kind of feel sad that, I didn't really appreciate the day itself. But I can remember when I spoke to the few players for the book, there was definitely, I think everybody was kind of fed up with each other. I don't think anyone knew about the fight between Neil Cox and Ravanelli until afterwards. But yeah, it was really stupid. For the Daily Star, Neil Cox had a friend who was a reporter, and they asked Neil Cox to pick his team, who he thought was going to start, and he left out Ravanelli. Neil Cox says because he thought that he'd heard that Ravanelli was injured, so that's why he didn't pick him. But when they were lining up for the photo, apparently Ravanelli started shouting off obscenities at Cox. And I think it just sums up the atmosphere at that point. Neil Cox, rather than try to explain himself, or he just was happy enough to go and launch into a fight with him. So I think it shows everyone was kind of fed up with Ravanelli at that point.
Yeah.
And then I can remember I spoke to Craig Hignett, and he said that the coach kind of just before they went out to play, he would kind of like did a big speech, and he told everyone to kind of pull themselves together. This is the FA Cup final. Like, some of you will never be back at Wembley. Like, you got to go out there and appreciate this moment. And apparently for about a minute, everyone was fired up and ready to go. But then, of course, Di Matteo scored within 46 seconds or whatever. And I think I remember being in the stadium, and when Di Matteo scored that, it felt like the game was over already. Festa had a goal disallowed, which if we had VAR these days, I think it would get overturned. So, who knows? But yeah, it wasn't a particularly fun day.
No, a difficult end to the season. I've actually spoken to Neil Cox for this show, and yeah, his telling of it is very similar to yours in terms of just how I think the frustrations perhaps with Ravanelli had just hit boiling point, haven't they?
Oh, wow. I need to go back and listen to that then.
So I'm going to give you the opportunity to take a game from this season to the deserted island with you. So if you could pick a game to stick in room 101, what would you go for?
This is the game I can take out.
Yes.
I know you had Rob Fletcher on. I think he talked about that Blackburn game. So yeah, I mean, in theory, I probably would, because we played Blackburn later in the season to make up for that game, and we drew 0-0. If I could take away that game on the basis that we then get the other game, then I probably would pick that. But as Rob picked that, I think one game which I think the lowest point as a fan for me during the season was when we lost at home to Sunderland. Sunderland were in the relegation battle with us. They were not particularly good. They were awful up front. This was before the Kevin Phillips played for them. This was after that March run, so we were starting to get back into bad form. I think we just lost the cup final replay as well. Sunderland came to us. Juninho was injured, so he didn't start. They got an early goal, and then we just played awfully. I think Nickelback hit the bar, and it was just one of those games where we just didn't look like we had a chance. And I can remember that being a really depressing moment. So I'd definitely like to consign that game to the abyss if possible.
Okay, that's gone. No problem at all. That almost brings us to the end of your deserted island picks. There's one more for the very end. Before we do that, I want to get your help on a regular feature we have on the show, which is the Premier League of Nations Hall of Fame. So what we do is we try and put who we think is the greatest Premier League player from every nation on earth that has played in the Premier League at some point. Now, alphabetically, we are on to Brazil, which is quite fortunate for you. Now, as you'll see in a moment, I'll take you through the shortlist. As there have been over 100 Brazilians who've played in the Premier League, we actually split this down to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to ask you who you think is the greatest Brazilian midfielder or attacker. Before we do that, there have been a few that haven't made the shortlist. I'll take you through them now. It's not Robinho, the Manchester City striker who scored 28 goals in 100 caps, but never quite lived up to the hype, having been bought on the same day the Abu Dhabi group took over Manchester City. I wonder what happened to them. It's not Kleberson either, the Brazilian midfielder that Phil Scolari said was the driving force behind his national side's 2002 World Cup win. He joined Manchester United soon after. And it's not Emerson either, the defensive midfielder who swapped Bobby Robson at Porto for Brian Robson at Middlesbrough on his way to relegation and double cup final heartbreak in that cult Boro team of 96-97. And narrowly, I don't think it's Willian or Roberto Firmino either, who did win 3 Premier League titles between them across 500 plus Premier League appearances and effectively cancelled each other out for being shortlisted against this list, against this incredible quartet. So here are the 4 players I put to you are the greatest Brazilian midfielder or attacker. Is it Juninho Paulista, the Premier League's Brazilian trailblazer, voted Middlesbrough's greatest ever player in 2007? He had 3 spells at the Riverside, beginning in 95, when a £4.25 million move was greeted with a stand full of delighted Teessiders, and ended in 2004, when he helped Boro lift their only silverware to date in a League Cup win. He was runner-up to Gianfranco Zola for the Football Writers Player of the Year in 1997, and played for his national side 49 times as well. Or is it Fernandinho, a man Jamie Redknapp called the greatest defensive midfielder the Premier League has ever seen, which is high praise indeed from a man who once spent a season playing alongside Stefan Freud. Fernandinho was part of a dominant Shakhtar team after moving to Europe before switching to Man City, where he won 5 Premier Leagues, 6 League Cups and an FA Cup. He does speak 5 languages and says his greatest inspiration is Jesus, or possibly Jesus. He doesn't fully clarify if he means former teammate Gabriel. Or is it Philippe Coutinho, the former Liverpool player whose attacking prowess was enough to command a fee north of £105 million to Barcelona? Before that, he'd wowed Premier League fans with his mazy runs, Ivan needle assists and spectacular goals. He returned to the Premier League to join former teammate Steven Gerrard's short-lived Aston Villa era in January 2022, where he remains at the time of recording, albeit as not quite the same player that once left the Premier League for a 9-figure fee. Or is it Gilberto Silva, the Arsenal invincible, with 89 Brazilian caps to his name? A combative midfielder, he very nearly gave up football aged 16 to work as a labourer and in a sweet factory to provide for his family who lived in extreme poverty. Thankfully, he rediscovered his boots to make 170 Premier League appearances for Arsenal between 2002 and 2008. Of his upbringing, he said, "I'm glad I had that tough start. It makes me identify with people who are not so lucky." He is now patron of a charity, the Street League, a UK-based charity which organises football matches for homeless people, refugees and asylum seekers, and also has a giant anteater named after him at London Zoo. But I put it to you, Tom, that Juninho Paulista, Fernandinho, Philippe Coutinho, and Gilberto Silva, one of those is the greatest midfielder / forward to ever play in the Premier League. Who do you think it is?
Well, I'm not being biased, but I think this is a pretty easy answer, and it's definitely Juninho Paulista. I think if you go back and watch this season, I think you just see what a talent he was. He came runner up to Zola, like you say, for the Football Rights Player of the Year, which was obviously a bad call, but he did win the Premier League Player of the Year. I think he's the only player to win that from a team who didn't finish in the top 6 or something like that. I think his story of like coming to Middlesbrough at the peak, he was an example of a player who came on the up. Like I said, most players who were coming to the Premier League during that period were kind of on the down slope of their career. He could have gone anywhere in the world. He came to Middlesbrough, and he just took the league alight. And I think that if we'd stayed up that season, then it would have been a whole different story of his career. I know that Alex Ferguson was interested in signing him. That's kind of like another kind of like sliding doors moment. He was looking at replacements for Cantona. But he ended up going to Atletico Madrid, and he had that awful injury, which basically changed his entire career. Right at his peak, he got cut down. So I don't think we don't really know what he could have been. But I think as a footballing talent, I think if he had played in this era, I think he would have absolutely thrived. I think he could have easily been that type of David Silva player, that Bernardo player. I think he would have slotted into that role perfectly. For the 2002 World Cup, he had kind of reinvented himself as a kind of pivot midfield player. At Middlesbrough, he was basically given free rein to do whatever he wanted. If you watch some of those games, particularly in that month of March when he won Player of the Month, he absolutely took on Chelsea pretty much on his own. He did the same with Leicester. I think he was genuinely pretty extraordinary talent. I think if he played in this era, I think he'd be world class.
Yeah, well said. A fantastic player and a real cult hero, obviously, both for the Premier League and at Middlesbrough. So we're going to put this out to a vote. So you may or may not agree with Tom. We're going to put it out on Twitter, and your votes will decide who the greatest Brazilian midfielder or attacker is. So that will be out shortly after this show's been released. But finally, Tom, before we let you go, I'm going to give you a football to take with you to the deserted island and give you potentially all eternity to recreate one Premier League goal from this season. Which goal would you go for?
So I was kind of looking at what goal I want to go for. Emerson scored some absolute belters this season. He scored a 30-yard banger against Hereford. He scored a great goal against Sunderland. But those are kind of the obvious ones. But I decided to go with Juninho's goal at Old Trafford against Manchester United. It was a great team goal. And I feel like I could just amuse myself by passing the ball around, pretending to be all the different players. Yeah, that game, it was a bank holiday. We went to Old Trafford. We needed a win, and we went 3-1 up against United, who were basically on the verge of winning the league, best team in the country. And we were playing unbelievable football. And this goal just it's like looking at, Pep City today. I mean, we passed it around United. Juninho was directing players where to pass the ball. And then he made a 1-2. He made 2 1-2s with Ravanelli, made a 1-2 with Hignett, and just carved the United defence apart, and then slotted it past Schmeichel. It's probably my favourite goal of all time, to be honest. So I had to pick that goal.
Yeah, Pep's Man City is a good comparison, because I think it would definitely now be called playing in between the lines. They're just moving Man United about, and it's a fantastic finish. Juninho starts it and finishes it, and that was looking like a very precious point at Old Trafford in those final games for that battle against relegation. So a great pick. And don't forget, of course, you may have Gianluca Festa on the island with you to get involved and play the role of Fabrizio Ravanelli.
That's true, yeah.
Well, Tom, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Tell us about your book, and if for anyone who is watching on YouTube, I do have a copy here. It's absolutely fantastic. You're joking, aren't you? Where can people get it, and sort of tell us a little bit more about the premise of the book?
Yeah, so the book is it's basically about Middlesbrough's the 96-97 season. It takes it through month by month, and then it picks one game per month to kind of zoom in on and focus. It just kind of tells the story of that season. I was lucky enough to speak to a bunch of players and to a few writers and fans from back then. Yeah, I think it's one of the kind of great stories of Premier League history. I think it's something that you'll never see anymore. I mean, the idea that a club like Middlesbrough would be able to fund through a local businessman to be able to compete with the rest of the country is kind of unthinkable these days. You know, the signings that we made, I think that, you know, it was generally one of the most shocking things ever when we were signing people like Ravanelli and Juninho. In terms of its availability, it's, you know, obviously it's available on Amazon. It's been out for a few years now, so I don't know how many copies are left. I've noticed that the price has gone down. I think it costs more to ship it these days than to buy it. But I mean, I think you can get it in some bookstores, probably closer to Middlesbrough. I'm not sure how far it gets outside of Middlesbrough, but yeah, it's still about there if you need it, if you want it.
Well, I'm a neutral, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's a really good read, so you don't have to be a Middlesbrough fan to enjoy it. If you remember this season well and want to relive it, there's plenty in there for you. So thank you for joining me, Tom. Really enjoyed speaking to you. Thanks for sharing your Deserted Island matches with me.
Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
So that was Tom Flight. I really enjoyed that episode. I loved reading his book, and going through it in more detail was fascinating. If you are a Boro fan and you don't have this book on your bookshelf, what you're doing, you've got to get this book. If you just have a passing interest for this season, if you just really have fond memories of this season as I do, I would highly recommend this book. I don't think you need to be a Boro fan to enjoy that particular book. So You're Joking, Aren't Ya? It's available on Amazon or at a bookshop. The closer you are to Middlesbrough, the more likely you are probably going to find that on the sports non-fiction aisle. If you are a Middlesbrough fan, though, and you're discovering the show today for the first time, I do have quite a bit of content for you already on the channel, both on all podcast platforms and on our YouTube channel. I spoke to Neil Cox at some length a few weeks ago. Well worth a listen, including what happened between him and Ravanelli and lots more during his Boro days. And also Rob Fletcher, the author of 1992, The Birth of Modern Football. That was a really great episode. We talk about the formation of the Premier League and also all sorts of things that happened in football in 1992, but in between, quite a lot of Middlesbrough-based content in Rob Fletcher's episode as well. So do go and find those, and I hope you enjoy. And if you do enjoy, please do leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts, or drop me a subscribe, leave a comment in the box as well on YouTube. All of these things help me find more people. I really appreciate it. We're growing every week. We've had some great numbers on the last few shows as well. Really, really appreciate all of your support. So please do keep sharing the show and help me find new people, including the lads at my gig in Woodford on Friday night. A great bunch of lads who I got chatting to at the end of the show. They were quite a few beers in by then, but I'm pretty hopeful that at least one of them put the show in the group WhatsApp. So if you are listening or watching, lads, thank you very much, and I hope the hangover wasn't too bad on Saturday morning. Last week, I asked you to pick the goal of the season for 96-97. You did, and it was a bit of a landslide. 74% of you choosing Paolo Wanchop's solo mazy run at Old Trafford for Derby against Manchester United. That really did beat the competition by some distance this week. It's a little bit closer on your favourite Premier League player from Burkina Faso. Bertrand Traoré, as picked by my guests, is the greatest Premier League player from Burkina Faso, and he goes into the Premier League of Nations Hall of Fame. Of course, I did speak with Tom this week about who the greatest Brazilian forward/midfielder was. You heard what he thought. No surprise, he picked Juninho. I will be putting that out on Twitter and X, and I'm going to try putting it out on YouTube. I believe I can put it out as a poll. So if you're listening to this, now would be a great time to nip onto the YouTube channel. Maybe have a look at what me and all my guests look like. I mean, if you've seen the logos of this show, you've already got an idea of me in Subutio form. It's nothing special. However, do go onto our YouTube channel and like and subscribe while you're there. I'd really, really appreciate that, and help me build numbers on YouTube as well. There should be on the channel a poll if I've worked out how to do that correctly after posting this. Next week, we return to the count up the all-time Premier League table. We're up to 45th, and it's the turn of Cardiff City. A very interesting chat. I've got a comedian coming on the show next week. Di Rees-Towler will be with me talking all about Cardiff City's Premier League spells, 2 separate seasons separated by quite a few years. Di is a proper die-hard Cardiff City fan. He wears his Cardiff City replica shirt while gigging quite often, and he's a very knowledgeable fan. So a really great chat that I had with him. That is coming next week. In the meantime, all the details about how you can subscribe, where else you can find it, how you can buy me a coffee, should you wish to, all in the description for this show. I will see you back here next week with Diaries Towler for Cardiff City. Until then, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. See you next week.